It's a standard playbook. This is something that has been going on for about 20 years now with the U.S. State Department and NATO in Central and Eastern Europe in order to control the internal politics. This was what we call our rule of law programs and anti-corruption programs. This was something that was funded substantially by USAID, by the U.S. State Department, by NATO and EU grant-making bodies, and by private donors like George Soros. And this has been a way to control internal politics. What's changed is that those Central and European post-Soviet states were, when these sorts of abuses happened at the end of the Cold War from the 1990s through the early mid-aughts, this was seen as, well, these are corrupt countries. It's not really where we in the U.S. or Western Europe, the sort of classical Western civilization, live, and so that's just how things are done there. But what we've seen is this exact same network behind the lawfare in the U.S., behind the lawfare in France, behind the lawfare in Italy, and now in Germany and Spain, in Brazil and in Pakistan, have taken that exact same blueprint, which is that if you can't beat them, ban them. And this has made a total mockery of the whole concept of democracy. While we have the rise of China happening simultaneously, and them not having elections, but investing in their own infrastructure, we're seeing that in the West, increasingly, we don't have elections either. It's all of the Orwellian horror without any of the infrastructure or economic development, because every single person on that list was a populist, was deemed a threat to democracy. Like, they're the only politicians committing crimes, and they're committing them serendipitously, when they're on the verge of winning. Marine Le Pen is up 11 points. Before her conviction, she was up 11 points in the early voting, in the early opinion polls for the 2027 election, blowing anyone else out of the water. And she nearly won last election cycle. The CIA, via the Atlantic Council and its other think tanks and NGOs and foundations that work in cahoots with the CIA on soft power, have been waging this campaign against Le Pen. There was an incredible incident in 2018 when Marine Le Pen nearly beat Macron in the 2018 election, and the Atlantic Council, which is funded by the Pentagon, the State Department, USAID, and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. It has 7 CIA directors on its board of directors. They made an image around that election. I'm showing it on screen. They called it Democratic Defense Against Disinformation. And right in the center of it this is about the Macron election in 2018. They put Jack Posobiec and WikiLeaks as the targets who were undermining support for Macron by sharing the leaked files of his own corruption. So you have 7 CIA directors on the board of that organization, which still gets paid tens of millions of dollars by the U.S. government, who are openly plotting against U.S. citizens for sharing social media posts that support Marine Le Pen. So this goes very deep, and there's a lot more on this if I can, depending on how much time we have.
So they basically, had they been successful in taking out President Trump, either with lawfare or an assassination, they tried, they would have had pretty much checkmate on the whole world. They're already doing it in these other countries. Thank God we've got Trump here, but had they been able to sidebar Trump in some way, throw him in jail, keep him from running, doing what they're doing in these other countries, the globalists pretty much would have taken over the world. Is that what I'm hearing?
It would have been 1,000 years of darkness, because the nice thing about the U.S. having sovereign leadership and smart leadership right now is that it can throw its weight around to try to save other democracies under attack. For example, the reason they took out Le Pen is because she wanted to withdraw from the military command at NATO. This is exactly what Charles de Gaulle tried to do. NATO used to be headquartered in Paris, and then Charles de Gaulle wanted to pull out of NATO. That's how it moved to Brussels. And the CIA ended up orchestrating a coup against Charles de Gaulle in France in the 1960s. This is a very famous episode in U.S.-French relations. We have been constantly playing around in domestic French politics, both before and ever since the 1960s. There was a famous incident, for example, when the CIA Red Cell memo was published by WikiLeaks, showing that the CIA was in the process of rebranding its war on terror in Afghanistan in order to try to get the French Parliament to vote for more war funding for the NATO operation there. And the CIA proposed to the State Department in this memo, everyone can look it up. It's the Red Cell Memo on Feminism by WikiLeaks. I believe it was around 2011 during the Obama administration. And what they proposed, the CIA proposed, changing the framing, the branding of the war to emphasize things like feminism and women's rights, because the French electorate was not afraid of terrorists enough coming from Afghanistan, so we should focus less on national security and sell it to the French people as being about women's rights. This is a cynical abuse of empathy towards feminism just to rig French parliamentary votes to get them to give more money to the NATO war machine. Now, that was during the Obama administration. And again, like I've said ever since, I have no doubt that Pavel Durov was arrested in France, the owner of Telegram, as part of a NATO operation to seize control over Telegram and shut down Russian, Russian-favored Telegram channels, or to try to play around with the back end to spy on Russians in Telegram by getting back-end access from Pavel Durov. That happened in France. That would not be possible, I believe, without direct coordination with the U.S. Embassy in Paris in order to have U.S. consent on that. We saw in the JFK files just last week when they were released that it turned out that 75% of the State Department attachés in the U.S. Embassy in Paris were actually CIA. 75% of the people working in the political division in the U.S. Embassy were actually secretly working undercover for the Central Intelligence Agency, and that at that time, the CIA occupied the entire top floor of the embassy and was actually boxing out the State Department from accessing it, quote, monopolized access to the leader of the French Parliament. So what we see here is this deep connection between the blob, this transatlantic blob, this sort of, Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, Hillary Clinton, the same network here in the U.S. tied to Macron, and they're trying to use those networks in France in order to stop a sort of new non-aligned movement of Trump-aligned populists. And again, if you can't beat them, ban them. And we are now, on the last legs of democracy, unless the U.S. punches back and says, hey, that's not consistent with U.S. values. Why are we involved in NATO if NATO countries are going to literally ban the leading opposition figures from running in the elections? We need to fundamentally renegotiate, or at least threaten to, our involvement in NATO in order to make sure that rule of law is actually sustained in these countries on the brink.
I got about a minute left. I want to kick it to you, but here's my question. If all the information that you have, and you are so knowledgeable on all of this stuff, you've peeled back the curtain on so much of it, is this literally what's happening? We're seeing the curtain peeled back on the forces behind the scene, the globalists that have been trying to lead to take over the world, push an agenda. We're getting it pulled back, and we're seeing that our CIA, our government, has been way more involved than some boogeymans in other countries. Is that basically what we're hearing? And is NATO a big part of that? Should we pull out of it? Final thoughts to you. Got about 60 seconds.
That's exactly right. What I believe needs to happen right now is DOGE and the U.S. State Department, which just inherited the USAID portfolio, needs to do a full and total review, declassification, and publicly publish every single U.S. rule of law or anti-corruption program that touches any of these countries where the opposition leaders have all been arrested on completely tenuous, is a very charitable way. I mean, I don't know how to say it without expletives, but the fact is we need, just like there was an autopsy done on so many other USAID programs and so many other State Department and NED and U.S. Institute of Peace programs, everyone's talking about the judges right now at home, the district court judges who are effectively more powerful than the U.S. president. If only we had elected Trump as a district court judge, then maybe we could actually have sovereign control over our own country. But the fact is if you pierce the heart, every classified document that the CIA is sitting on, Elon just met with John Ratcliffe at CIA headquarters right now. Every one of these rule of law programs where we touch the judges, where we touch the courts, where we touch the prosecutors, the American people have a right to know how our own tax dollars funded the fluff judiciaries here who are absolutely devastating the lingering remains of the legitimacy of Western democracy.